This morning for our call to worship words, I'd like to share an excerpt from a piece called Beyond Self-Care Bubble Baths on Community Care by a writer named Abini Jones. Abini Jones is a trans woman of color, artist, educator, writer, and designer living in the Bay Area, so not too far from you. Abini writes, "Something important I've realized as my depression has gotten worse is that contrary to my shame, many members of my community are more than happy to carry that burden. I've received messages and texts saying, 'How can I best support you?' This has become my favorite question, and it's the first one I always ask whenever someone I know is struggling. I don't do this because I feel guilty or feel like I need to repay them for care they've given me. I do it because I want to. It feels good, and I love my people. And sometimes it's the part of movement work that I'm best at. My community members take care of me for the same reason. It brings them joy. It gives them purpose, and it's maybe the only movement work they are capable of too, for whatever reason. Taking care of ourselves, surviving and thriving, as the self-care rhetoric reminds us, is a radical act, and so is taking care of each other." Thank you to Abini Jones for those wise words. So for those of you in the sanctuary who couldn't see what I wrote in the chat for the Zoom folks, even though I put that video together with friends and their beautiful faces at the end of 2020, it definitely still feels relevant to me as we come to getting close to the end of 2021. It's hard to believe how much we still need self-care, community care coming out of this pandemic. I was so glad to hear that my friend and colleague, Reverend Brian, is gathering you together for those chances to share about how you're feeling, because there's just so much, I think, that we are still carrying. And to take care of yourself, to take care of a community is not easy. It is definitely not the easy way out to say, I need some time for myself. And so it moves me, even as many times as I've watched that video, to see those folks' faces just taking those moments for themselves. We're talking today, sharing today, singing today, feeling today together about the ideas of community care, and particularly how it relates to mental health struggles, which have been exacerbated for many of us during this period of pandemic and isolation and destabilization. I want to share with you, to start here, a story from one of the sources of our living tradition of Unitarian Universalism, and that source is lived experience. Something that I love about being a UU, and I was born and raised UU, I thank my mother for that. And one of the things that I love about being UU is that we honor that this is a living tradition, that wisdom is growing and evolving, being added to, and that our own lived experiences are a part of our source. So this story comes from Twitter, a great source of lived experience in our modern world, from a woman named Sheila O'Malley, whose Twitter handle is Sheila Kathleen. And this story spoke to me right away. I relate to it because I lost my own father and have struggled with what happens to our lives when we lose someone we love. She writes, "The year after my dad died was so bad, I don't remember 90% of it. I moved to a new apartment and was unable to unpack for months," she says in caps. "I was ashamed I couldn't unpack. How can you be unable to unpack?" Now, I've recently moved and you can't see it here, but there are definitely some unpacked boxes back there. So I'm relating to Sheila. It's hard sometimes. She says, "My good friend David, whom I'd known since high school, knew I was struggling and felt helpless. He said, 'You are loved. We need you.' And I was like, 'Doesn't matter, but thanks.'" So he took a risk. It could very well have ended badly, she says. I could have lashed out. I could have been really offended. And I want to pause the story here because I imagine many of us have been both people in this scenario, the person really needing someone to reach out to them, and the person who wasn't sure whether they should take a risk or do something. And it doesn't always go well, as Sheila says, but David sent out an email to a group of local friends without her knowledge and said, Sheila is struggling. She needs our help. Let's all go over there and unpack her apartment for her. Bring food. Let's make it fun. And I love that suggestion. Not just, oh, you need to come over here and unpack Sheila's apartment, but bring food. Let's make it fun. And when I first started sharing this story, it was early in the pandemic, and it was so hard to imagine even going in someone else's apartment back then. And maybe for some of you, that's still hard to imagine. We're still navigating these things. But the vision of coming to someone's house and helping them turn it into a home was really moving to me. By the end of the night, she says, 4 hours later, it didn't even take that much time. She says, my place was a home. Not only was everything put away, but now I had a memory attached to it. And this, I think, is key. A memory, a group of my friends laughing, eating, dirty jokes, hard work. And at the end of the night, she says, she looked at a friend's husband, a quiet, taciturn guy who drives a tugboat on the Hudson. A man of few words. She looked at him speechless, not knowing how to say thank you. He looked at her, understood, and said, listen, baby, what we did today was a barn raising. And I love that phrase, and that's where this title of our service comes from. He said, listen, baby, what we did today was a barn raising. And that's what Abridged Jones was talking about in our call to worship, that we do things for each other like this, like the tradition of barn raising that is lost to most cultures now, except for the Amish and the Mennonite communities out east mostly. But the idea that we would joyfully build something together all at once, or unpack all together all at once. Now, in the traditional barn raising, where a community would come together in one day and raise the barn or the church building, on Wikipedia, it describes that the men would do the building, the women would provide the food, and the kids would play. Of course, I would like us to envision a genderful and inclusive universe now where we choose the role we're going to play in our community barn raisings based on our gifts and what brings us joy, as Abridged Jones was talking about. But there's definitely a need out there for us to be paying attention, like David did to Sheila, for where people are struggling, where we are isolating, not just because of the pandemic, but because something is troubling us, because we are struggling with something within ourselves, within our own lives. Shame was keeping Sheila from reaching out. So trying to pay attention for where some folks in our own lives might not be showing up like they used to. It's exciting to come on the screen and see all of your faces. I wish I could reach through and give you a hug. I wish I could be there in the sanctuary with those of you who are there together. And I want to ask you to think about who might not be here. Is there anyone who hasn't been showing up as often? Is there anyone who might need a little more outreach like Sheila Kathleen did? I bring this up because we know that mental illness is taking a toll or exacerbated during the isolation of the pandemic, and it affects so many of our lives, whether personally or for a family member or loved ones. And it's far more pervasive and human and common and real than we talk about. And it's especially important that we talk about it in church communities, and I'll talk about why. But because I'm talking about mental health today in the context of community care, I also want to just invite you to listen to your own body. This is personal for so many of us, myself included. And so if you feel yourself feeling uncomfortable, look at where you can adjust, move if you need to move, breathe when you need to breathe. And when there are things that touch you in your heart, ask yourself what you need around that. And when there are places where you might disagree based on your lived experience, your source of wisdom, I hope that you'll share that with your community and discussions when you can. This is an important topic in religious settings because some religions teach us that we should be ashamed of our struggles. There are some theologies that tell us that to have suicidal thoughts are to go against God. And so it's important that in a religion like ours, in a tradition that says all are loved, all are connected, that we be able to lift up without shame the things that trouble us, the burdens of our hearts and our minds. It's also important because more people die from suicide than homicide. It's the second leading cause of death, suicide is, among college students and adults ages 15 to 34. Now, this is pre-pandemic numbers, so I don't know how COVID affects these rankings, but LGBTQ youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. These are our children, our people, us. And so it is so important that we destigmatize issues of mental health. I serve as an advisor to the Sims Foundation, which is a foundation for mental health and substance use recovery for the music community. And it's expanding, and so hopefully it will come to California soon. But it certainly touched a lot of us in the music community this year, as we haven't been able to do, or last year especially, the things that we love. What I want to say is that if you struggle with mental health issues, not only do I hope that your community will barn raise for you when you need, and that you will return that as you are able, but I want to say that some of the greats of our lives are right there with us when we struggle. There's a book called Lincoln's Melancholy. Maybe you've read it. Usually I like to hold up the books that I read and show people over Zoom, but this one I read on my Kindle. And so you can see my Kindle, which is rainbow colored, like my couch and my stole. One of my joy practices for getting through hard times is colorful things. So anyway, in this colorful Kindle, there is a book called Lincoln's Melancholy, and it was sent to me by a friend who struggles with depression and is a great leader himself. And he shared with me, that it was worth noting that one of the presidents that we lift up was fueled by his depression in some ways, wanting to overcome it, and that some nights Lincoln's friends stayed with him to make sure that he made it through the night. That is something I've never forgotten from reading that, just the idea that his friends stayed with him so he made it through the night. Mr. Rogers, did you see the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? That was a great one a few years ago. Mr. Rogers' wife talked about how depressed Fred Rogers was after his retirement. Fred Rogers was a community minister like myself, and his show was his ministry. And anybody who ever watched it, I think, would know that it was, right? His show was his ministry. So after he retired, he really struggled with his purpose and what to do. And I imagine that many of us who have retired, and I aspire to retire someday, can relate to that struggle. One of my favorite moments in that documentary, and you may remember this song, is when Daniel Tiger has a duet with his friend Lady Aberlin. Now, Daniel Tiger was basically an avatar for Fred Rogers. He was the most like Fred, they said in the documentary. And which makes it all the more touching as Daniel Tiger confesses that sometimes he feels like a mistake. The song goes like this. Often I wonder if I'm a mistake. I'm not supposed to be scared, am I? Sometimes I cry and sometimes I shake, wondering, isn't it true that the strong never break? I'm not like anyone else I know. I'm not like anyone else. And what chokes me up about that verse is not that he struggles. We all struggle. We are human. What chokes me up is this idea that in confessing that he struggles, he thinks he's not like anyone else. Knowing that you struggle should be something that connects you to everyone else, because we all do. And so it just kills me that Fred Rogers or Daniel Tiger or any of us would think that in feeling this way about ourselves, we are alone. I hope that Unitarian Universalism, that our religious communities, if we do one thing, it's to help each other feel less alone. And then Lady Aberlin responds in song. I think you are just fine as you are. I really must tell you, I do like the person that you are becoming. You are my friend. Quiet or shaking or dreaming or breaking, there's no one mistaking you're my best friend. But here's the thing about what she sings. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't magically cure Daniel Tiger of his depression or what he's struggling with. They sing their verses together. They sing on top of each other. It weaves in and out the song. And so this is what I want for our UU communities, that we might accompany each other, that we might sing these duets of life together, where we show up for each other and we witness what we're struggling with, and we go that road together singing, but not expecting necessarily that something like, I think you're my best friend, is going to fix it, right? We're not going to fix it, but we can be together on this path. I invite you to take a breath and reflect on what is helpful to you when you're struggling, or how you like to be accompanied, while I pick up the papers that fell on the floor. It's good timing too, because I'm at a place in the sermon where I want to pause and share something else with you. But you can find that Daniel Tiger video on YouTube, and it's really sweet. So, some of what religion is really important and good for is naming things. And that simply, from the beginning, right? Naming the animals, naming the earth, the creation, naming is a very important part of being people of faith. And so naming what it is that we struggle with. In my own family, in my own extended family and community, there's some things that I want to name that are part of my world are depression, anxiety, PTSD or post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, eating disorders, suicide, and personality disorders. These are things that are part of the extended family that I love so much, that brings me so much joy, laughter, peace, success, love, birth, and rebirth. They are a part of us. And I name them in case there's someone here who has any of those in your life and has never heard those words in church before. I hope that's not the case in terms of never hearing it, but I hope that we might talk about these things to be community together. And then I want to commend to you my favorite spiritual resource when it comes to mental health, especially depression, and our spirit. It's a book called Not Alone, Reflections on Faith and Depression, and it's also in my Rainbow Kindle. It's by the Black womanist theologian Monica Coleman. I've heard her speak before. I really love her work. And in this book, she does short devotionals, short reflections, 40 days on faith and depression. And what I think is great about that, unlike Lincoln's Melancholy, which is a very dense book, when you're struggling, sometimes it's very hard to read long pieces, right? Or to do anything at length. So to have something short really helps. I think that's why sometimes we get sucked into what they call doom scrolling, reading your Facebook, reading your Twitter, because it's digestible, right? And it's if this doesn't work, we go to the next thing and we hope to fill this void. But I love Monica Coleman's book, Not Alone, Reflections on Faith and Depression, because she gives us little questions, little things to ponder, to nourish our spirits when we're struggling. But here's what she says about it. She says, depression is part of my life, whether I tell anyone or not, whether I hide it or not. She says, I'm afraid of being called crazy. I'm an academic. I make a living off my mind, and my mind can play deathly tricks on me. She says, I'm a minister. I tell people that God loves them and wants the best for them. The truth is that depression can make you question everything, especially whether God loves you. I'm mortally afraid of talking about this, yet I will. So we do. We take her example. In her book, she asks questions like, what song lifts you up? Who in your life can handle your truth? She describes asking you to write what you know to be true about yourself. Sometimes she writes down, I'm an academic, I'm a minister, I'm a mother, to help her remember those things when they don't seem true. She gives us this advice when things are at their hardest. She says, have faith. There will be winters where the only evidence of life is deep below ground. Always darkest before the dawn. That is why I have this stole with the sunrise, to remind me that it is darkest before the dawn and a new day is coming. She says, practice hospitality. This, we go back to Sheila and David. Practice hospitality. When you're running on empty, may someone open the door, cook a meal, pull the chair back, share. She asks us to practice acceptance. Remember that no one is unbreakable. You are already enough. You've already done enough. This is a good one too. She says, seek laughter. What can you do to laugh more? What makes you feel more alive? My family has been watching, I don't know if I told you this last time, but the show Nailed It, which is just people baking badly, trying to bake cakes that match these fancy cakes, and then they lift the thing when they're done and they go, nailed it, but it's usually terrible, and it's so funny. It doesn't have to be a serious thing. Find your go-to laughter thing that you know will make you laugh when you need it. Laughter is part of the spirit too. And she says, I love this. She says that she thinks her medication as a Eucharist. She says, who am I to say God doesn't heal through a pill? And this goes for anything that we might be taking medicine for, or might be doing some kind of practice like stretching. I've been doing physical therapy and I hate doing all my stretching. But what if I thought of it as a Eucharist? What if I thought of it as receiving divine healing? So whatever it is that's nourishing you, make a list, put it someplace close by, let it be there for you and help you remember. And the last thing I want to say about this, she lifts up that as much as we can ask people to tell us when they're struggling, again, sometimes even that is too hard. So we're asking each other as community to be noticing, to be paying attention to when somebody needs a barn raising, little or big, to be paying attention when someone's not here. And it may not always go as well as it did for David and Sheila, but to reach out, to take that step in community, to try and bring someone in when they've drifted away. I want to thank all of you for what you've been doing to stay together during a long, almost 2 years now. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of your service this morning. It helps me feel connected to the beautiful community of Unitarian Universalism that we have all around the globe. It's a gift. May we be barn raisers for each other and for a world that needs it.